All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are diving headfirst into a topic that'll really make you think.
That's right. We're talking about globalization, the digital age, and get this, how it's all kind of pushing us back towards the Middle Ages.
You heard that right. Knights and castles and all.
Well, maybe not exactly like that. It's more nuanced, more about the underlying structures of power and how things are shifting.
We're diving deep into Professor Stephen Kobrin's paper, and he's asking a big one. Like, is the modern era, the one we all grew up with, all those clearly defined countries and borders, is that system on its way out? Like, kaput?
It's a bold statement, that's for sure. Think about it. For centuries, the world has operated on this idea of territorial sovereignty, right? Each country gets its own sandbox, its own turf, and what happens in those borders is their business.
Right, like my Monopoly board, except with less yelling, usually. But now, with the internet, digital money flying around the world faster than you can say globalization, people buying things from halfway across the planet without a second thought.
And that's exactly what Kobrin is getting at. He's saying globalization, especially with technology turbocharging it all, is making that old idea of a country being all-powerful within its borders kind of outdated.
So no more clear lines on the map, everything's blurry.
Exactly. Take the internet, for example. It doesn't care about physical borders. It exists in cyberspace. It's its own thing. And suddenly, international gets really, really complicated.
And it's not just the internet, is it? Kobrin mentions Indian programmers, like working on New York bank systems in real time.
Right. So where's the transaction actually happening? India, New York. It's almost impossible to say.
It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because it's not just about, like, the internet being weird. Kobrin is arguing this is changing the whole game, economics, politics, the whole shebang.
Absolutely. It's like everything's intertwined now. Globalization,
Yeah.
particularly its digital side, makes it really hard to separate what's happening in one place from another. Our old way of thinking about economics and politics might need a serious update.
So, okay, it's like we're playing this massive game without any real borders, right? Everything's overlapping, getting tangled up. How does that even work?
Well, think about it like this. Imagine owing allegiance to, like, multiple groups at once, having to constantly balance competing interests, figure out where your loyalties lie. It's kind of a recipe for, well, chaos. Kind of like how things were back in the Middle Ages, actually.
Okay, yeah. I guess it wasn't all knights and chivalry back then. More like shifting alliances and backstabbing, if we're being honest with ourselves.
Exactly. You had these overlapping loyalties constantly being tested, and you never quite knew who you could trust. And it wasn't just individuals either. Remember those non-state actors we talked about? They were major players back then, too. Think the church, powerful merchant guilds. They all wielded serious influence, often rivaling the authority of kings and emperors.
Right, like the Pope telling a king what to do. That's wild.
It was a different time. But in a way, we're seeing a similar dynamic play out today with globalization. Think about organizations like the UN, the World Trade Organization, even those massive multinational corporations. They all operate across borders, wielding power that goes way beyond any single nation.
Okay, so we've got history rhyming a bit here. Instead of knights and popes, now it's like CEOs and international organizations calling the shots. Is that what you're
You
saying?
got it. These new power players, they're not bound by the same rules as traditional nation states. They've got their own agendas, and they're not afraid to throw their weight around on a global scale. And this is where things get really interesting, because it challenges our whole modern idea of how power works. It's not just about controlling territory anymore. It's about influence, networks, and the ability to shape the global conversation.
It's like the rules of the game are changing right before our eyes, and we're all just trying to keep up.
Exactly. And it's not just about who has the power. It's about how they use it. Take, for example, Doctors Without Borders. They go into conflict zones, providing medical aid, saving lives. They don't have an army. They don't control any territory, but their impact on the world is undeniable.
Right. Talk about punching above your weight class.
Exactly. And it's not just humanitarian organizations either. Think about the role of social media in global politics. You have these online movements, people coming together across borders to protest, to advocate for change. It's a whole new level of interconnectedness, and it's shaking things up in ways that we're only just beginning to understand.
So we're not just talking about, like, the internet making the world smaller. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how power operates in the world.
Precisely. And this blurring of lines, it goes even deeper than that. Because it also touches on something else that the modern world likes to see in black and white, that line between public and private. Globalization. It's making that line blurry, too.
Okay, hold on. Public versus private. You're going to have to break that one down for me.
Yeah.
What's that got to do with this whole neo-medieval world we're talking about?
Well, imagine, if you will, a feudal lord back in the Middle Ages. To him, there wasn't a huge distinction between his own personal interests and the well-being of his entire domain, his people. It was all kind of one and the same, intertwined.
Right. What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine, especially when you're the one holding the sword, I guess.
Exactly. Fast forward a few centuries, the modern era comes along, and boom, everything changes. Individual rights, the separation of church and state, government taking on the role of providing public goods. It was a whole new way of thinking about things. And that's where things get interesting, because with globalization, we're seeing that old way of thinking challenged once again. It's like we're hitting rewind on a few centuries of history.
So it's like we're going back to the future, but like the really old future. Everything old is new again, right? But seriously, this whole public versus private thing, is it really going to be a free-for-all like in the good old days?
Well, it's not quite that simple. It's more like those lines are getting blurry again. Think about the rise of private security firms, those gated communities. People are taking matters into their own hands when it comes to safety and security.
Makes you wonder, who are you going to call?
Right. And then there's the internet, the ultimate example.
Yeah.
Is it public, private? Who's really in control?
Yeah, it's like we took a wrong turn at Albuquerque and ended up in the Wild West, but online.
But seriously, how do we even begin to make sense of all this? It seems like a recipe for disaster.
Well, that's where things get really interesting, right? Because it challenges our whole way of thinking about the world. Those old categories, those neat little boxes we like to put things in, they don't really work anymore.
Okay, so we need a serious upgrade to our mental software. Got it.
Exactly. And that's what Kobrin is getting at. He's saying we need to rethink our assumptions, be willing to embrace the complexity. It's not about going back to the Middle Ages literally. It's about recognizing the parallels, the challenges, and yes, the opportunities that come with living in a world that's this interconnected. Okay, so less knights in shining armor, more like digital diplomats.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It's about finding new ways to work together, new models for global governance, new ways of thinking about power and responsibility.
Because let's face it, the challenges we're facing today, climate change, global pandemics, cyber attacks, none of those respect borders. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole conversation so important, because it's not just about understanding the past. It's about using those insights to create a better future.
A future where hopefully we're a little more prepared for whatever curveballs the world throws at us. Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today. From knights in shining armor to digital diplomats, from the fall of Rome to the rise of the internet.
It's been quite a journey, and we've only just scratched the surface.
That's right. The deep dive never really ends, does it? But for now, we're going to have to leave it there. We hope you found this deep dive thought-provoking and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Because at the end of the day, the future is not predetermined. It's up to us to create it. So keep those brain cells firing, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep the conversation going. Until next time, happy exploring.